Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Yeah, I have to report that tomorrow. So before we begin today's program, I want to tell you a little bit about Oatlands. We're a site of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The property has been owned by the National Trust since 1965 when the Eustis family donated it. And I want to acknowledge also that Oatlands is on the unceded and ancestral lands of the Piscataway and Manahoac and other nations whose history we are still learning. And Oatlands is a site of enslavement and trauma. And our mission is to recognize and honor these people who came before us and to tell a full and accurate story about that history. And our talk today is an example of that. And I'm going to welcome Dr. Sheri Huerta back to Oatlands. She's done several programs here, including one last November about Indigenous women during the time of the American Revolution. And you can watch it on our YouTube channel, which I also encourage you to subscribe to. Dr. Huerta holds a PhD in history from George Mason University, specializing in the antebellum South, slavery, legal history, and social culture. She is currently an adjunct professor at Mason, where she was recognized with the Adjunct Faculty Teaching Excellence Award in 2022. And we also have partners in today's program: the Black History Committee of the Friends of the Thomas Balch Library, and Gary Clemens, Clerk of the Circuit Court Historic Records Division. And both have tables set up in the middle room, and I encourage you to visit with them after today's talk. And so what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Alicia Cohen from the Black History Committee. She will turn it over to Eric Larson, and then they will turn it over to Dr. Sheri Huerta. Oh, and lastly, I do encourage you to pick up the Loudoun 250 Committee just published this booklet with great information about our county's connection to the American Revolution, and a list of sources and places to visit. So we have some of those booklets over there on the table before you leave today.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I see some familiar faces. I'm not sure if you just stayed the whole week or if you just came in today. But anyway, good afternoon and welcome to our third talk in this program related to the American Revolution. As Laurie said, I am Alicia Cohen, and we both are with the Loudoun, Virginia 250, and also we both are on the Black History Committee. We are so excited to hear and learn about the many ways the enslaved and free people claimed their rights and freedom here in our county during the upheaval and social change of the American Revolution. There's so much to learn. We hope this sets the stage for you to continue learning and sharing this history and how this can apply to today. To continue to support learning about the revolution, there's also other programs, and I'm leading a program that happens March the 30th at the Russ Library. The title is Black Patriots and Loyalists During the American Revolution. It's at 2 o'clock, and I have flyers out on the desk. And I hope that you will learn as much from our scholar as I will. Eric?
We do need it for the recording.
You have to hold it.
Okay. Hello, my name is Eric Larson. I'm the Historic Records Manager for the Clerk of the Circuit Court. I think many of you know about our collection, know me from the other events we've done with Oatlands and at the courthouse. I want to welcome you here today, but let me tell you a little bit about how these two have actually been involved in our records, our slave and free black records. Sheri, about 4 years ago, was the advisor on my grant to VFH. It got all the county free black records scanned, and they're free to the public and they're up on our website. Lori, if many of you may have known, actually worked for me for 2.5 years before Oatlands pulled her back. And during her time there, she was able to make connections to get money to scan all of our enslaved records, and she did a lot of the indexing in our Past Perfect database for the enslaved records. She also indexed all of our will packets that had enslaved individuals on it from the county's beginning in 1757 to up to 1867. So these two have played a very important part in preserving the records and the heritage and the history of African American history here in Loudoun County. And we're very pleased that they're part of it. What we have here today are some copies, facsimiles. I'm not allowed to bring the real things in, but you're welcome to come in and see them out on the table. What I did is we went through, Shannon and I. Shannon, say hi. Hi. Shannon. Celeste, say hi. Celeste is my new employee, actually. She hasn't started yet. She starts next Thursday. So I got 2 of my employees here. So, yeah, you don't know what you're getting into. Okay. So we put together an exhibit of enslaved documents and free black documents from the Revolutionary War period. So I welcome you to come out and actually see them afterwards. It's just the tip of the iceberg, what we have in our collection. We probably have the largest collection of free black and enslaved records in the state of Virginia, simply because in 1862 the court justices ordered the county clerk, George K. Fox, to send all the records to Campbell County. That saved them from destruction during the 62 occupations of Leesburg and Loudoun County during the war, and they came back in 1865. Because of that, we have most of our county records from the very beginning. I welcome you to all come in and view them. You can see the real thing. You look on our website. We have stuff posted. Like I said, all the free black papers are posted. All the enslaved records are also, if you wanted copies, are free too, simply because the grant Lori got stipulated that we had to offer them to the public free. So yeah, please come out to us. We're open 8 to 4, Monday through Friday, and come in and see what we do, okay? Thank you. There you go.
Well, thank you, everyone. I really want to express my appreciation for you coming out on a beautiful day like today, and always for the constant support of Lori and Oatlands, and Eric at the Court Archives, and Alicia and Donna with the Black History Committee. You all are doing incredible work here, and I'm so thrilled and honored to be just a small slice of what you're doing here on the ground. So when I was thinking about talking about freedom and the Revolutionary War era, I mean, we're so fortunate there's so many different kinds of documents that are available out there. And so I want to start this as a conversation, a series of questions that I, as a researcher, started asking about the Revolutionary War. And what are the stories, and what are the things that we're going to be talking about? So one of those stories that really struck out to me came from the pension application files. And this is a story of Daniel Coleman, who was a free man of color, who decided that, you know what, he wanted to make it aware, he wanted to make known of his participation in the Revolutionary War. So on December 13th, 1827, he went to the courthouse as a 93-year-old man and stood up in front of the Superior Court and the magistrates and the elite of the county and everyone who was there in the room and said, I served in the Revolutionary War, and this is my story, and I want this to be remembered and recalled. So he brought up stories of how he had enlisted in the Continental Forces, and that from that point of his enlistment, then he went to Taneytown in Maryland to join up probably with a muster or a rendezvous at that point. He had memories of serving in Colonel Muhlenberg's regiment, and he remembered that he was there until the capture of Cornwallis at Yorktown, and that he was part of that group that then came back to Virginia from Yorktown. Part of what he needed to do to make his declaration for this pension process was to have a couple of witnesses on hand. So these witnesses were there to swear out that they knew for certain that Daniel had enlisted, that he was in the service. He was there when he said he was. And this is pretty remarkable considering that this is 46 years after he first entered the service. So I was wondering, who is this Daniel Coleman? He's a free person of color. He doesn't show up on the census records, which is one place. He doesn't show up on property tax records. But I did find mention of a Daniel Coleman who is listed in the household of Captain John Luckett. Now, this comes from a tithable list of 1779. The tithable lists were those lists of people in the county who were at least 16 years of age and older. They wanted to count the number of free white men, 16 and older, who could then be called upon to serve in the militia, and also who could be taxable for county purposes. But also included in those tithable lists in this early period are those enslaved men and women who were age 16 and above and considered tithable. And tithable generally meant that you were of a working age or that your labor could produce some kind of wealth. So I find him there in this household of Captain Luckett, who has 2 enslaved people identified as Peter and Carrie, and 2 other people identified as Robinson Crusoe and Daniel Coleman. And based on the way that they're placed after the enslaved people, leads me to suspect that they may have been free people of color. Usually white tithables are listed right underneath the householder. So this gives me a clue that Daniel may have had a longer presence in Loudoun County than we think. So when thinking about this story of Daniel and his decision to go into the courthouse and make the statement that he was part of this Revolutionary era, it got me thinking about, we are in the semi-quincentennial, right? We are talking about the Revolutionary War, and we're starting to have those decisions on a large scale, on a national scale, and a small scale of how we remember this revolution, right? So my goal as a historian is to think about these stories that we tell each other, to think about the kinds of evidence that's out there, the kinds of documents, and then to peer through that in a way that says, what's not here and what should be here? What could be here but isn't said explicitly? And how might we see this as part of evidence of broader stories about people who aren't traditionally within that narrative of Revolutionary War soldier, military service, heroes, and the founders of our nation? So we know that there's approximately 180,000 enslaved people in Virginia at the start of the war. And so my discussion today doesn't focus just on Loudoun County, but some of the decisions that all of these enslaved people and free people of color were faced with during these very tumultuous times. So it was really helpful for me to think about what is happening in Loudoun County during the war era. And for here, I had a lot of different sources out there to think about. And one source that maybe you didn't think about or that I hadn't thought about before was looking at pension records. So I've got a ton of details up here. These are all things that took place in Loudoun County that were mentioned in the pension records of Revolutionary War servicemen. Now, people that are mentioning these events were not living in Loudoun at the time. They had already moved further west and further south. But those events that took place in Loudoun were so stuck in their minds that even 30, 40, 50 years later, it stuck out to them. And so these things call to us to say, what was that time like? Well, we might think about, of course, a big letter event was June 14th, 1774, with the decision of the Loudoun elites to support what was happening in Massachusetts and give their support against the British government and their resolves. We might think about then 2 years later, on August 12th, 1776, when the Declaration of Independence is first read aloud to Loudoun County from the courts of the steps of the courthouse. There it is. We might think about when early in the war the Hessian soldiers from New Jersey were being transported through into Northern Virginia, and some of them were quartered here. What stories were they telling to Loudouners? What stories were enlisted or enslaved and free people of color hearing from the Hessian soldiers about the world beyond Virginia? We might think about those stories that not everyone was on board with the Revolutionary era, those times of trouble when people were called to be drafted into the service, like in 1777, where 8 men were brought into the courthouse for raising tumults and disorders in the state because they were opposed to the draft laws. Or later, a couple years later, when there's another uprising of Loudoun County residents who weren't really sure that they wanted to be drafted and didn't want to have that burden placed on them. We see that during these times that there's a lot of gatherings, rendezvousing, marching through and within Loudoun County, and these are events that would have brought the notice onto enslaved people. They would have been talking with others, they would have been gathering information about where they're going, where they had been, who's going to be away, who are you following, what is the news of the war, what are the British doing, right? So thinking about these events make us think perhaps a little more broadly about what it means to be connected to the Revolutionary War, and how people who have what we may perceive as the least ability to be engaged in those things often had very much a stronghold of information and a lot of different ways. So enslaved people were not immune. They would have been affected by these wartime disruptions, the constant movement of people in and out, that ability to gain information also provided ways to slip away and find their own space of revolutionary. Now, one of the common things is thinking that the Revolutionary War really kind of starts this revolutionary impulse, this impulse towards insurrection, or this impulse to pushing back against enslavement by a political power, right? Enslaved people were already causing their own revolutions long before the Revolutionary War. And there's a lot of cases about what was happening to them just before in the 1760s and 1770s of their own revolutions against the enslaved power in Loudoun County. That we want to think about that as well. So in thinking about all of these different events, there is that sense of, okay, maybe we can break down what are some of the ways that Loudouners were maybe directly contributing to the war effort. So one an interesting section of documents and records are those these are the commodities that were impressed from local people into the service of the Continental Forces and the service of the patriotic war effort, right? So we have here these lists of all the different kinds of food sources and supplies that were used to support the war effort. So we might take a look at a provisioning document like this. This was receipt from that William Dolan had contributed 27.5 bushels of rye towards this war effort, and that he received money for those supplies. So it may be tempting to think that men like Dolan and there were hundreds of there were more than 200 receipts that were turned in for supplies for beef, bacon, rye, corn, brandy, whiskey, all kinds of things that were contributing towards those soldiers in that effort. It's really tempting to think that this was the sole effort of William Dolan, because his is the only name on the list, right? But what if we take a look again at those tithable records and track down William Dolan there? We see that, and now it's super fadey, but that's kind of the stuff that we work with as historians and researchers. Everything isn't really clear, so we have to kind of dig. But we do have there William Dolan and a name of Negro Lucy. So he had an enslaved woman named Lucy who was at least 16 years old. And we can probably make some conclusions that she had something to do with the cultivation of all that rye, that she had something to do with the harvesting of all that rye, that she had something to do with providing that labor that allowed the Dolans to create this bounty that supported the war effort. Okay. Does that change our thinking about contributions? Well, I wanted to take a look at another one. And again, this is from a list that are held. These are on microfilm at the Library of Virginia. And these are more of like a spreadsheet kind of thing that showed everyone who had turned in a receipt for things that they had supplied. And in all of that fuzzy writing there, again, this is William Douglas Gentleman, who had provided 100 pounds of beef that was stall-fed, as opposed to pasture-raised, right? He provided 2 tons of hay for the Pennsylvania Brigade. He also contributed 132 gallons of brandy and 110 gallons of whiskey towards the effort. He's making a lot of stuff, right? And I mean, this sounds like awesome. He's making those supplies that really help keep the soldiers going. Once again, if we take a look at the tithing list, there are at least 14 enslaved people who are listed as being in William Douglas's household and were likely enslaved by Douglas. So it raises the question, who was producing that stall-fed beef? Who was caring for that? Who was creating all of these goods and products that contributed to the war effort? So I encourage us to think then beyond just what is given in the records and to dig a little bit deeper and think, what other questions can we ask about this? And how might that expand our understanding of Revolutionary War contributions? Now, we might think that immediately I'm going to jump into military service, that would be the next logical step, but I'm not going to. Because we're going to shift our thinking totally and think about, in this war, there were multiple sides in the war, right? And we've got the British to contend with as well. And recognizing that enslaved and free people of color were also paying attention to what the British were doing. So we've raised questions about involvement, but maybe we need to consider further about what other strategies enslaved people could take to claim their freedom. And that they would understand a little bit about the British as well, based on the knowledge that they're getting from multiple sources here. So thinking about this then, that there's often the question of why would enslaved people, why didn't they jump onto the patriotic cause, or why did they join the British cause? Well, I wanted to investigate that a little bit further. But in order to do that, we need to take a little step back first and think about what was happening in the British Empire. Now, 1772 marked a landmark case called the Somerset case. There's a lot to this, but I want to just briefly point out that this was a legal case about a man who was born in West Africa, was taken to Virginia and sold as a slave in Norfolk there. He was sold to a merchant, and that merchant then tried to bring him back to England. And while in England, Somerset, or James Somerset as the man was known, he became baptized because he knew that baptism could be one step closer to getting his freedom. But he's also being very aware of British laws about slavery. So when Somerset's enslaver decides that when Somerset said, "I want to be free," the enslaver then hires a boat captain to capture Somerset. And then the boat captain is going to take him back over to the West Indies, probably Jamaica, to sell him into slavery. Well, friends of Somerset said, we need a writ of habeas corpus. We need a writ that even though he might be enslaved, he is still a British subject, and he is entitled to that right to have his body produced forward before any further legal action can take place. And so Lord Mansfield, when thinking about the case, said, you know what, I'm not going to argue about the legality of slavery. That's going to be a big issue here. We're going to focus on the issue of the habeas corpus writs. But he did say that when thinking about slavery, that you really needed to have a positive law, a law that says specifically that slavery should take place. And England didn't have that. So it left that door open, and many people started to interpret the fact that Somerset case said that if you get yourself to British shores, you're going to be free if you are enslaved. And so that may have influenced enslaved people who are thinking about the British now coming closer and closer to them, and their ships and their war stores as a way to get even closer to British-held law where there wasn't the law of slavery. Okay. So that was in 1772. Now, between then, there's some skirmishes that take place. Dunmore is doing a lot of things, and there's a lot of information about Lord Dunmore out there, and I don't want to dive too deeply into what he's doing, but I do want to point out a couple things that is taking place in 1774 and 1775, is that Dunmore starts to see that these colonists in Virginia are not very happy with the British, and he knows that one way maybe to keep them under control is to use that threat of enslaved rebellion. And if Dunmore could say to the Virginia colonists, you know what, I'm going to support an enslaved rebellion if you do not do what the British government wants you to do, that could be a very influential, I guess, teaser, a way of making these colonists come to heel. So what he does is that he decides to remove the gunpowder from Williamsburg. And of course, immediately people around Williamsburg were all up in arms. It goes even as far to Loudoun County, where there's discussions about if Dunmore can take away the means for us to protect ourselves against enslaved revolution, that's a problem. And Dunmore realizes that he's opened a huge hornet's nest here with this decision. So he is trying to use this idea that if he can kind of suggest that enslaved rebellion is going to happen, that he might have better sway over the colonists, right? Well, so what he does then, when things, the relationships kind of degrade, he does create a proclamation that says any enslaved person who comes to him, or indentured servant, right, that if they are well-bodied, able to bear arms, and they would join the magistracies, the British troops, that they would receive their freedom. Now, even before he made the official proclamation, enslaved people are starting to realize that we might need to cling a little closer to Dunmore. He may have the key to our success, to our freedom. And so at least by November, at least 100 enslaved people were flocking to Williamsburg, were flocking to Dunmore to see if they could get in on this freedom train. And this is really important. And now Dunmore knows, I mean, he is writing to others, he says that these people of color are flocking in from all quarters, which I hope will oblige the rebels to disperse, to take care of their families and their property. Well, what he has opened then is something that cannot be put back into the bottle, right? More and more people hear about this, and say people are going to the British lines, they're going to wherever the British are, they're going to the ships, and enslavers know this. Suddenly in this time, enslavers are starting to write runaway slave advertisements that say, I'm pretty sure he's joined Dunmore's troops. Pretty sure that they flocked to the British. We think that they're going to be there among the British. Well, the Virginia colonists are, upset about this. They're very concerned about this. James Madison writes this letter to his friend William Bradford. He says that he is really convinced that an insurrection is going to take place. That already they're noticing that these uprisings, that there's more agitation, there's more organization among enslaved people around Williamsburg, in Chesterfield, near Richmond. There were already acts of enslaved people in Loudoun County who had committed acts of violence against their enslaver or who were put on trial for acts of violence against their enslavers. So this is not a limited thing. But what Madison says, I think, which really struck to me, is that there, even though the intentions of these possible insurrections were found out and proper precautions taken to prevent the infection, it is prudent such attempts should be concealed as well as suppressed. And so you see kind of a hush about enslaved rebellion, because if you're writing about the newspaper, guaranteed that enslaved people are already they knew about it 2 weeks before it came out in the paper, right? So there's this attempt to suppress what is happening, this debate. Well, meanwhile, the Fourth Virginia Convention then at this time is starting to recognize they may need to take some action. And how can they maybe stop the flight of enslaved people to British lines? So they decide that what they want to do, what they need to do is start to push back against this idea that the British are going to offer freedom. So one of the tricks that they use is going to the newspaper, and they'll say straight up, knowing that enslaved people are going to get a hold of this news, that people are going to be talking about it. They may be able to read it themselves or hear about others talking about this. But they call them out. The colonists are saying, enslaved people, you might have been really flattered by this notion that the British are going to give you free, but guess what? That's not happening. That's not really what's going on here. They're not going to take your elderly people. They're not going to take your children. They're not going to take your wives with you. All of those people are going to be sold into the West Indies, right? And it's going to make a worse situation for you. That this may seem like a kindness. But it is wicked enough to provoke the fury of Americans against their defenseless fathers and mothers, their wives, their women and children. Let them only consider the difficulty of effecting their escape and what they must expect to suffer if they fall into the hands of the Americans. The Virginia colonists are putting out this threat. If you're an enslaved person and you run away to the British, something is going to happen to you, and it won't be pleasant. They're talking about execution on one hand. They're talking about most people who are captured are either sold out of the colony, or they are sent to the lead mines in Fincastle County for the duration of the war to produce then lead for the colonial effort. So you see a lot of petitions coming after the war of enslavers arguing, my enslaved person was taken to the lead mines and I want compensation. Not, I want them freed, I want compensation. So these threats were put into place. Right? Even so, more and more people realized, enslaved people realized that their best chance might be to get behind those British lines. And so the flood kind of starts to take place. We see here an example of the Willoughby plantation from Norfolk County, where there were, nearly 100 people that have gone to the British lines in 1776. And this enslaver makes a list of them. Now, looking at the most of these people, which category are most of these people in? I mean, they're women and children, right? Women and children were running away in droves. Only a few of them might be considered, those 16 men, those able and willing to bear arms. But the British are taking these families in. For the most part, they're taking them in as best they can. And we see then that it is not just later petitions that are going to the government, there's also then newspaper coverage of events like this. Now, Dunmore and his troops, he is creating an Ethiopian regiment of free and formerly enslaved blacks who are serving for the Majesty's service. They get into some scuffles at Great Bridge Battle near Norfolk. And after that, then Dunmore decides to kind of pull back a little bit and kind of like hunker down on Gwynn's Island. That's there in the Chesapeake. Another factor going through is smallpox. right? A lot of the British had already been inoculated against smallpox, but most of the enslaved people that had joined them had not been. So they're suffering terribly. They're dying by the hundreds of smallpox in these very close quarters. So the newspapers are publishing the names of people. The first names is the enslaved name. The last name was the name of their enslaver. And pointing out here that out of this group, 50 of them were women that were on this Gwyn's Island. So as the Patriot forces are moving closer and closer to Dunmore's fleet, he has to leave the island. And when he leaves the island, they leave most of the sick behind. As perhaps as many as 500 enslaved people are dying or dead on the island, either from smallpox or from when the Virginians are coming in and said, we need to stop the spread of this disease. We're just going to burn everything down. So some of the sick yet not dead were caught up in those conflagrations, this effort to purge from the disease. So we get a sense of here, this is a map that was created for Thomas Jefferson about what that meant to, enslaved people, and Virginians are starting to realize what it means for them, the dangers of going to the Patriot side or to the Loyalist side. If they're going to the British side, they're going to be in these areas. They're susceptible to disease, smallpox. About 60% of people who contracted it at the time did die from it, a rather gruesome death. Also, then they could get camp fevers, typhus fevers. So it really was a very dangerous, biologically speaking, place to be. Well, as the British are sailing away from Gwyn's Island in the Chesapeake Bay, they meet, going up the Potomac, a ship that is coming south from the Potomac. And this small watercraft happens to have 3 men in there, most likely enslaved, who have run away from Mount Vernon. One of these men, his name was Harry Washington. Historians feel that he was on the ship that is meeting Dunmore's troops on the Potomac there. And Harry Washington stays with the British and works for them throughout the entirety of the war. And we're going to see what happens to him on the way back. So we see here that these runaways are not just affecting everyday Virginians, they're also affecting George Washington, they're affecting Thomas Jefferson, they're affecting James Madison, they're affecting the Virginia elite. So it begs the question then, how many people would decide to claim freedom by escape and by running away? I was really kind of intrigued by this. And I thought, well, maybe I need to go back to an earlier question of thinking about, okay, well, who is most likely to run away? What do you think? Who's most likely to run away? Young men, absolutely. And if you look at runaway slave advertisements, the typical person there in those advertisements is a young man, right? Don't talk too much about women or children going along well. And for a long time, historians sort of agreed with that thinking. They had these different ideas for why young men would be the ones to go. They're the healthiest. They're at that situation where they're able to just break out and leave on their own. They don't have any ties to keep them behind, right? They're probably at the peak of their physical ability. They have some skills likely that would make them, hireable in a different market. And on the other hand, they kept thinking about, well, women. Well, women wouldn't do that because what were women concerned with? Their children, absolutely. They're thinking about their children and this idea that enslaved children would keep enslaved women at home. And this is a thinking that goes on for a long time among enslavers, right? That, women had more responsibilities, that they had perhaps fewer skill sets that could be financially viable outside of their own plantation, or even that they didn't have the knowledge of the landscape to make that flight possible. All these things were those stereotypical prejudices that said, no, women aren't really going to run away. But research and taking a closer look and asking different questions is starting to change that. So we're thinking about this in a deeper way as historians. That now, what if we shift that idea of skills to say, you know what, women had skills too, right? They could very easily slide into an urban space and get hired on as a cook, as a nurse, as a domestic laborer. They knew how to market things, they knew how to make things, they knew how to buy and sell things. They had a lot of game going for them, right? So enslaved women could be very marketable out in a different landscape. And certainly in terms of them going to the British lines, they could serve these functions as well for British officers who were looking for someone to take care of their uniform, to make their food, to make their nice life for them while they're on these troops. So these women are leaving. And I want to refer to that, thinking of that idea about motherhood as a constraint against mobility? Well, oftentimes, that during the Revolutionary War particularly, motherhood was the catalyst for encouraging running away. Mothers did not want their children growing up enslaved. They wanted to do the best they could for their children, and that meant having them leave and taking them with them. So I want to refer to the research of Karen Cook Bell, who's written an incredible book that takes a look at this question of escape from bondage during the Revolutionary War era. And she surveyed over 1,000 runaway advertisements from across the colonies. And she found that the average age of women who were leaving was about 22 years old. Most of them generally fit in within the age of 18 to 25 years old. But there were some as young as 13 years old that were leaving independently or as a solo journey, and some as old as 62 who were leaving with family or their children. So it really expands our thinking about who is capable of running away and why would they do that. So it adds this question here to thinking about these other possibilities of what to do this. And as we saw in some of those earlier documents, certainly from the Willoughby plantation, the majority of people who ran away were women and children. So taking a look at some of these runaway slave advertisements is again a way to ask questions. I want to take a brief look at Winnie's story. Now, Winnie comes from Northern Virginia. She's out of Fauquier County, and she had already escaped before the Revolutionary War. So there's that question of, does the Revolutionary War change running away in certain foundational ways? I mean, yes and no. Before the Revolutionary War, there were fewer enslaved women who were advertised as runaways, and the ones that were advertised typically traveled by themselves. During the Revolutionary War era, now there's more, up to 30% of the runaway advertisements were about women. And most of these women are leaving in groups with their children and family or with other groups, sometimes from across multiple plantations. So there's much more coordination happening here. Remembering that runaway doesn't just happen because war is on. Winnie already had experience. She had left in 1772. She had lived for months all the way into Maryland, even though she had come from Fauquier County, right? And she took skills with her. She knew that she could pass as a free woman by presenting herself as a free woman. If she had clothing that looked a little more upscale, she could do it. She could hire herself out. She could stay under the radar and live as if she were free. Well, somehow after 1772, she's brought back, but she escapes again. And it's almost months later before her enslaver decides to advertise for her. And we know that this little Q, here, TF means keep advertising till found. So when you're looking at advertisements, you want to see what this little stuff down here is. Sometimes we might say 2W for 2 weeks, or 2AW, twice a week. Tells you how long the enslaver thinks that he needs to advertise before they can get that person back. Well, looking through some of the records, I found advertisements for Winnie up until October 18th, so only a few months after this time. So I don't know if she was reclaimed or what, but she'd already been gone for a few months before then. Now, women, what might draw them back from running away? Maybe they're pregnant. Maybe that's one of those reasons why women wouldn't want to run away, because they were pregnant. Well, we had the case of Jenny here, who is coming out of near Petersburg. She had a 2-year-old, a toddler, a 2 or 3-year-old. If you've ever had one of those, they are really hard to get to go with you anywhere. But she's also great with child. She is deep into probably the last trimester of her pregnancy. So she is doing this as a woman deeply pregnant with a toddler. She's also carrying her clothing with her. Again, she knows that she has to present an appearance as if she's free. So she's taking those pieces of clothing that will make that appearance more plausible. She's also going to change her name and the name of her child, so no one will know her by her slave name. It's another strategy. And she's going to put herself into a space that makes it easier for her to blend in as a free person. All right? These women had skills, and they're using it particularly at this time. So I did want to ask that question about, how many enslaved Virginians then were going to the British or were using this time to flee from their enslavers, because that may give us a sense of that mobility that's happening, right? Now, Thomas Jefferson, looking at his own plantation, he had at least 30 of his enslaved people who had fled to the British. And he was able to track down that 27 of them, for 27 of them, he said this decision had, quote, consigned them to inevitable death from the smallpox and putrid fever that was raging in the camps where they had found themselves. So most of the people who had fled from him were reportedly had died because of smallpox. So then Jefferson takes his own experiences and conflates it and says, well, across Virginia, there must have been at least 30,000 enslaved people who were leaving, and probably as much as 90% of them were dead or died from disease. Other historians have challenged that. A more recent historian, Alan Taylor, says that during the war, maybe perhaps 6,000 Virginian slaves had fled to the British. And out of that 6,000, perhaps a third of them were able to make it out, through the war and on to freedom after the war. A third of them probably died from these different diseases. And a third of them likely had to be sent back or were sent back to their enslavers. So it gives us a way to kind of maybe think about that it's hard to nail down the numbers. But here, remember I said I was talking about Harry Washington, who had come in the ship, in the small boat that is heading south down the Potomac as Dunmore is moving north. Well, Harry Washington does stick around with the British and sticks around long enough that his name is included in the Book of Negroes. Now, this is a book that contains the names of at least 3,000 individuals who had come from the different plantations from across the South, but mainly from Virginia, and had gone behind Virginia lines. And their names and anything about them is recorded down in this book. Because at the end of the war, the British were evacuating those. The British did feel that sense of obligation to uphold that promise of freedom. And Harry Washington was one of those who had evacuated out of New York and gone up into Nova Scotia in Canada. So we kind of see here that this process of leaving and mobility was not just limited to the war era itself, but also after the war. Those enslaved people who had stuck with the British long enough, who had survived the smallpox, who had made their claims well enough to say that I have served the British enough that I should be given my freedom based on Dunmore's proclamation, they were enrolled as free people in these lists. And we know that there were three main ports of evacuation out of New York in the Book of Negroes. And I have a resource list that will give you places where you can find information about who's there. Charleston was another. Out of Charleston, they're going to, most of them to Jamaica, which was a British-held colony, right? But they're also going to East Florida, to St. Lucia, Halifax up in Canada. They're also being sent to England, right? And again, the southern route from Savannah is going mostly to the south. But these, this part of this diaspora of African-American loyalists went not just to North America, but they're also being shipped to England, back into London, a place around England, realizing that there they have very limited financial supports and it was a lot tougher than they thought. Some of them were then also sent to the British colony of Sierra Leone in Africa, as a way to kind of start a new life there, and some were sent to the penal colony of Australia. So there's this huge diaspora happening there. Right. So, having thought about this opportunity or this option or this decision to go towards the British, we then want to kind of shift and think, well, what were then another choice? Perhaps looking at going to where the American soldiers are. And so thinking about the African-American Revolutionary War soldiers and sailors, that it wasn't until 1776 that the Continental Congress had opened up even the option for Africans to serve. Washington was not against this, he was very much against this. But there was opportunities for African-Americans to serve, and they served in integrated troops. They weren't separated out. That some of the pension records tell us that more of the black pensioners from the South, about 75% of them reported receiving some kind of wound or injury during their war service. And this was a significantly greater proportion than those who had served in the North. There's an estimated 5,000 to 8,000 African Americans who served in the Continental Army. Thousands of them also served in state militias and in the Navy. And one historian suggests that there were perhaps about 500 enslaved Virginians who served in Virginia Continental Services. And we get a sense of kind of perhaps this, this huge bringing together, the integration of the different kinds of troops. A famous depiction of the patriots there who were in action at Yorktown shows that they came from everywhere and they were all put together. And even when you look at pension records, usually they don't ask you whether you were white or black. They don't ask you whether you were free or enslaved. You were just applicant, right? So that information is also not part of most of the pension records. Well, thinking about this and realizing that that there was kind of a decline, or they didn't have enough people to serve. Again, remember Loudoun County had a lot of disruptions about not wanting to go and not wanting to meet the draft. That the Virginia Congress decided to kind of change its mind here and says, all right, well, by 1777, that they're already realizing that a lot of enslaved people have fled. A lot of enslaved people are putting themselves up as enlistees, as if they were a free person. Going to get the money, you're going to get the bounty, which could be a couple $100. You're going to get bonus, you're going to get clothing, you're going to get food, you're going to get potentially a free status, right? But they're kind of worried about that enslaved people are taking of this advantage. They only want free people of color to kind of be in their services. So they make a law saying that you have to now prove your freedom before you can get into the service. And then once you're in the service, in Virginia service, that most of free people of color would be consigned to employment as drummers, fifers, musicians, right? Or the Pioneer Corps, those who were responsible for building and fortifications and doing the engineering kind of stuff. Well, this then makes the question of, how then can, make their claims. If you've been enslaved, you've gone through this war effort, you've seen the options that are out there, you've heard the promises that were made. How could you make those claims to freedom and make those promises the revolutionary ideals? Well, one way of thinking about this is that we haven't even quite finished out the Revolutionary War, and Virginia delegates decided, very much pushed by religious groups like the Baptists, the Methodists, the Quakers, to offer some kind of freedom. That the freedom and liberty that all of the patriots, white patriots, were shouting up so high against the enslavement by the British, should be an ideal for everyone. And so the 1782 Emancipation Act, or the Manumission Act, allows then a change so that enslavers can manumit or free their enslaved people either through a deed or by a particular bequest in their will. So it makes it much more of an easier process. And so I thought, all right, well, okay, so now there's this process in place. Loudoun County, tons of Quakers, tons of religious here. They should be jumping on board, because many of the southern counties in Virginia, their deeds of manumission said specifically, we're emancipating because this person, it's against our religious ideals to hold slaves. There was kind of radio silence from Loudoun County on that issue, surprisingly. I tracked down all the deeds of manumission and all the wills related to manumission in Loudoun County, and found that at least the first deed of manumission wasn't recorded until 1789, 7 years after this boon was part of it, right? What were they waiting for? That there were very few deeds of manumission written that mentioned religious ideals. And in fact, the first deed that I found, I think, wasn't until the 1820s that the enslaver said, it's my religious ideals that should make me free this enslaved person, right? And none of them so far had any kind of mention that they were being freed because of military service. Alongside this, Virginians also decided that, you know what, we do need to recognize those enslaved people who had served in our forces and grant them the freedom as if they should have been freed. So there's a law in 1783 that directed for those certain slaves, right? They're not opening it up to everyone, but you had to have proof. Then you could be emancipated if you had served in the Virginia or the Continental troops on the side of the Patriots, right? And this particularly mentions an enslaved man named Aberdeen, who was one of those who had tried to get to the British forces, but he was captured and he was sent to the lead mines. And because he had produced such, I guess, extraordinary amount of lead or his service there, he was able to get his freedom because he counted that as his patriotic service. Right? So we want to think about then that this wasn't always automatic. And I said that, the law says certain slaves. Well, an enslaved man named Saul, and I love his petition. I mean, the language here is just incredible. He is making a statement saying he did take up the musket. He went to the American standard, that American patriot flag, regardless of the invitation that was trumpeted forth by the British proclamations for slaves to emancipate themselves by becoming assassins of their owners. Right? That's how he's defining the British offer there. He says, your petitioner Saul avoided that rock that too many of his color were shipwrecked on. He was taught to know that war was levied upon America, not for the emancipation of blacks, but for the subjugation of whites. And he thought the number of bondmen ought not to be augmented. Is Saul writing this, or is a very clever lawyer crafting? I mean, he's got to convince the General Assembly, right? And this is pretty convincing. He had worked, he was a soldier for the American Army. He was a spy that was embedded into the British forces. And it was only because another enslaved person who was also spying for the British, found him out and threatened to imprison him that Saul was able to escape, right? But he didn't give up on the promise of freedom. And apparently neither did the Virginia legislature. They passed a law that allowed him, in consideration of the many very essential services he had rendered to this Commonwealth during the late war, he did get his freedom. So this brings us back then to this idea of who is serving and how are they showing this. And pension records are an incredible way of finding out who does this, but only if that person had actually submitted the pension as a full record and application. Once again, to thinking about this process of pensions. Now, Daniel Coleman is taking advantage of the 1818 law that says that there's a new pension law. They're trying to expand who is eligible for pensions. This is a time in our nation's history when it was incredibly flush with money. They had more money than they know what to do with. If only we had those days, right? They were also influenced by then President Monroe, who understood about the service of many enslaved people. And they thought, and also all veterans, Monroe was getting very nostalgic about the Revolutionary War era. And they thought, certainly there's not that many veterans around. This wouldn't be too many, not a big deal. But there were more than 25,000 people that suddenly showed up and said, I was in the war, right? And so we have this flood of people coming in to make their claims to their part of the Revolutionary War memory. Now, by 1822, the War Department that at least 17,730 people were on the pension rolls under the provisions of this 1818 Act. And Daniel Coleman is one of those who is trying to get in there. So what he has to do is first go into his courthouse. Now, imagine this. He's 93 years old. He has to stand in front of his county in the courthouse and remember all of these things about his service. He is doing this in front of a mostly white audience. He is also then having to provide people who will support his testimony, because it's not just upon the testimony of the petitioner alone. He also then has to go in and prove that he was in distressed financial situation. And that was part of this fear of that and the 1818 pension, that there were so many people rushing in to get these pensions that a lot of them really weren't financially needy. So by 1820, the law changed. It said you had to show that you weren't just getting rid of your goods so that you can claim some pension from the government. You actually had to be really pretty impoverished. And so from his claim of his financial inventory, he said he had no real property, no personal property, that his occupation was of a day laborer, which again kind of coordinates with that earlier tithable list, right? He didn't have his own. He didn't have a family to take care of him. He was 93 years old, and he's worried that he doesn't have enough money to live on. And so he was told that up until now, he didn't know that this was an option for him. And I think this is another thing to keep in mind, that a lot of people of color weren't really always sure if they were eligible for these benefits, that they weren't exactly eligible, that they didn't have the money or the connections to make it happen. So we see then that Daniel Coleman is coming in here, saying boldly, saying proudly, I was part of that war effort. I need to be remembered because I was a citizen and I rose to the call. I was there that did this, I did my job. And we've come back full circle of thinking about how we remember the war. He asked the county and the country to remember his service and the role that he played in building our nation. And so my final question here today for you is to thinking about how are we going to remember the Revolutionary War in the semi-quincentennial season? What stories are we going to look for? What stories are we going to accept? And what stories are we going to maybe pull a little apart at the edges and see what's behind that story? Well, I'll take it to you to move the charge forward. I want to thank you for being here with us today. Welcome to any questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. The obvious first question, did he get the pension?
He never put it forward. This is the first of the declaration process. Then the next step would be to actually send it to the War Department. And there's no evidence that he ever sent it forward. So he might have been, some people said that, there was some money involved. You had to pay someone to do this paperwork for you. And he may not have had the financial or those connections to put it forward. Also, he's 93 years old. This may have been the last big act of him to do this, and it may have timed out before it ever came. But I haven't found in any of the records, even as withdrawn or not approved. So, but it raises the questions, right? Yeah.
Hi. I have two questions. One is the Dunmore resolution said if you were a loyalist and your slaves escaped, they would be sent back. Do you have anything more to say about that? And number two, those people, I was amazed at that very interesting breakdown of where the people went from New York and Charleston and so forth. Don't you think being sent to Jamaica is sort of ominous in terms of what their fate would be, given that Jamaica and Barbados were two of the most incredibly awful enslaved places in the world?
I think that's a great question. And yes, there was that fear that some of them would have been sold back into slavery. And there's kind of a letter from Dunmore himself, because he knows after this proclamation that his time in Virginia is running out, that he's kind of on the outs with the British government for kind of starting this whole, brouhaha. And he writes kind of, I think, maybe in a coded message saying that he is taking, the enslaved people he has, and I'm going to make out of it what I can while I can. And historians have gone back and forth to say, does that mean that he is going to make out to make sure they get their freedom, or that he's going to financially profit from their sale into another market, right?
I think he becomes a governor down in the Caribbean later on in his life.
And of course, so Jamaica then would also, many enslaved people really felt that Somerset ruling said that they're now going into British territory and they may have an easier time of getting freedom, or that Jamaica was just one ship ride away from England. It was a hopscotching point. So, there is that sense of what is going to happen when they move to these new places.
I was just going to add to what Nancy was talking about, and I'll reflect on the War of 1812, when the British did the same thing. And when the British sent the loyalists to the Caribbean, they created free communities. And so, for example, in Trinidad, which was a British colony, and received these loyalists. Now, I'm basing this on the War of 1812, and I'm saying it's probably about the same. They had about 5 or 6 free communities in the southern part of Trinidad, which actually still exist. So my thought was, wow, they're sending these people down there, and they're going to be free, and everybody else around them is enslaved. How is that going to work? How did that work? So I'm just extrapolating that probably the same thing happened. I don't know, because Jamaica and some of the other islands were slightly different than Trinidad, but I think they set up free communities. That's kind of what I wanted to add.
And we do know that Great Britain is abolishing slavery in their colonies as well by 1838, all of their colonies. So they would have, if they hung out that long, they would have received their freedom sooner than they would have if they'd stayed in the States. And your the other question about loyalists, the enslaved people that belong to loyalists. Well, the British looked at that as they didn't have that same obligation to provide freedom for enslaved people from loyalists. Those enslaved people could be sold and the profits used towards the war effort. But we do know that a lot of discussion about getting these lists of people, that even George Washington is going to the British officials saying, hey, I know my enslaved people, you have them, I want them back, you can't keep them. And many of the British officers are saying, you know what, but we made an agreement, we made a promise. And whether Washington, you and the other Virginians and the other, patriots don't like it, we're going to uphold that agreement. So, there is that sense that as the British officers are making the lists of who is entitled to their freedom, that they're thinking very broadly about who is entitled to their freedom. And that there's also that some of the officials are very frustrated because a lot of the British officers are saying, well, these are the 5 enslaved people that have come to me and they have been working for me throughout the entire war. How can I send them back to their enslavers? I think that they should be freed for their service to me. And so the British are they have a lot of decisions to make. And part of that is how will they decide who gets a certificate of freedom and goes with the British forces away and who doesn't get that certificate. And sometimes it could be a factor of if you were close enough that you could get to those lines and get your name on the list, you were on the ship. And if you didn't make the ship, your ship had literally sailed, right? You didn't get on that list. So it was a very challenging time,
I would assume that a lot of enslaved people from Loyalist plantations did try to go and get free.
And if they had a good story about their ownership, that would, it's the strategy of making building the credible
sort
story.
of shows what you said originally. This was a war tactic. It was a war tactic. Sorry.
And I think that brings up the point that in every situation enslaved people and free people of color found themselves in, they had to be incredibly strategic. They had to weigh a lot of different choices and think about a lot of different possible outcomes. And this pushes back so much on that idea that they, didn't have choice, that they didn't know what's going on. I mean, we really need to recognize and applaud the amount of strategy and the amount of insights that enslaved people had to make these really difficult decisions.
All right, I had several questions, but the first one is about the tithables. When you list the tithables, obviously it's only the slaves over 16 that appear in there. Is there some type of formula that historians use to calculate the total population of slaves based upon the number of people over 16?
If there is, they haven't told me the secret code yet. I mean, generally we might go to the closest census record, so you might go to 1790 and see what was there, maybe extrapolate a little bit backwards. You might look and think about the tithables, how many of them are women, and what is the likelihood that they would have been childbearing age. Oftentimes many enslaved places had more children than they had adults. Right. If you look at other census records, you can kind of see, you can kind of chart out what is the typical age progression there and how many are more children than there are adults. So, one enslaved mother could have multiple children, and that would skew it more towards the younger ages.
And then I wanted to know if you had looked at bounty claims as far as any potential of free people that might have gotten bounty claims for service.
I looked through a couple of different sources. There's a great source, and it's on the resource sheet, about people who were possibly African American descent that show up on some of these size rolls. Now, a size roll is kind of like a muster roll, but what it's doing is actually they're taking down information about the soldier. How tall were they? What was their hair color? What was their complexion? What was their eye color? And some of these are described as being dark complexion. And so then Paul Hynek is his name. He went back and researched so many of them to see if he could find from where they came and if they appeared in any census records as black or white to kind of confirm their identity. So yeah, there is that challenge of finding race, and in an era when it wasn't as written down about in these kind of documents as it is, of course, in the Civil War. A lot of that has changed in documentation of that.
And the other question I had was related to, Alicia's comment about the War of 1812, that have you looked at, you were talking about incentive to run away and what bring that. Does it change over time? We had to deal with the Revolution, and then War of 1812, and then the Civil War. And so there's 3 periods just in Virginia that there's opportunities to escape from slavery. And does it change over time, do you think?
Yes, I mean, first of all, there's always an opportunity to escape, right? So that's just kind of the basic foundation. The Revolutionary War marked a shift because suddenly you see more women and children going together, and as many as 30% may have been female. In other time eras, perhaps as many as 19%. You might get, I looked at Fairfax County records, I think they have kind of a high watermark of 20% in the 19th century, a female is running away. You find different eras that promote a lot more of running away. The 1830s, for Northern Virginia particularly, excuse me, was an era where the domestic slave trade is booming. There is a huge need for enslaved people in the Deep South. And so Northern Virginia enslavers are realizing they don't have enough work to make their enslaved people profitable. So they're selling them off and away. In Prince William County, for example, and Loudoun County, I think is about 35% of that key cohort of between 14 and 25 years old are being sold away between 1830 and 1840. 35% of that population. In Prince William County, it's 50%. Between what years? Between 1830 and 1840. And that's using census data to track the numbers and how many of those should still be there 10 years later. So it's about 35%, I think, for Loudoun County during that one decade of that. So that's a key cohort. So that's a huge stress on enslaved family and enslaved individuals. You see then by the late 1840s and the 1850s, there's more efforts for not just individuals to run away across Northern Virginia, but this more turning into groups. And they were often talked about in newspapers as stampedes. So multiple people from across plantations that are working together in the 1850s because they know that something is going to happen, that the politics are there. They know that there's more stress on retaining enslaved people as property and holding that wealth with the fear that a gradual emancipation, they would lose that wealth. So property values are growing up tremendously after 1850, and there's more people that are running away. More people are also using weapons, guns. They're taking that with them. We don't see much of that in the advertisements in the earlier generations of wartime, but definitely by the 1850s it's changed. So, yeah. Eric. Oh.
Okay, I have one question because of some documents we have in our collection. Could you talk a little bit on how I think it was in 1777 or 78, the General Assembly passed that law. If you brought slaves into the state, you had to certify that, one, they weren't from the Caribbean or from Africa, and two, that you weren't bringing them here to be sold. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right. So I think it's one of those contradictions of history that Virginians were really worried about expanding the slave trade, right? They felt that the slave trade, and you hear this from George Mason, you hear this from a lot of the founding fathers that said, the reason why we have slavery is because the British foisted this on us. And they wanted to kind of stop that bringing in. They wanted to stop that for a couple of reasons. They were worried that enslaved people who had come fresh from the West Indies had also come fresh from Africa. And if they would come fresh from Africa at that time, they were probably captured during times of war. So these people would have had more war skills. They were warriors. They were captured in battle. And a captured in battle person that is suddenly taken to another place doesn't lose those skills just because they're on the water. And that sense that they had been in the West Indies, where again, populations, places like Jamaica, Barbados, could be sometimes 90% black, and that there was a much more robust atmosphere of learning about those war skills, being able to create maroon communities, right? They could leave their plantations and hide out in places where the whites didn't want to go track them down. People with those kind of skills were not the folks that Virginians wanted on their plantations, right? So they're very worried that someone's going to come in, that it could be a potential insurrection threat. So that's one of the reasons why they had to have these certificates of importation, saying if I'm bringing someone into Virginia, I need to go to the courthouse and affirm that this isn't someone that's going to be a troublemaker. This isn't someone from those danger zones, those hot zones. And it also isn't someone, I'm not contributing to the slave trade. I'm not just going to sell them away here. I would suspect that by that time, Virginians are starting to recognize that with the changing agriculture, right, it's harder to produce and sell tobacco. They've lost a lot of markets because of the Revolutionary War. They don't need as many enslaved people to produce these commodities. So if you have a surplus of enslaved laborers, do you want more slave laborers coming into the colony that's going to upset the market there? You're going to have a glut in the market. So it's also an effort to reduce the glut of enslaved people in a market that's already saturated, right? the Upper South, this part of Virginia, they have too many enslaved people for what they need to do to produce their goods. So we see, I know the Mason family are recording some of their slaves as they're going, it's not just into Virginia, but it's also Maryland. And there's a lot of conflict about some Virginians, elite planners that wanted to bring in more people were upset about this law, and they would push back against it. They may say, well, I married into someone who moved into Virginia, so I should be able to bring my property from this other state into Virginia, as some of their arguments. And it was an argument against the right of the property owners to bring and move their property as they wished. So those are also a great place to find names, because they have to specify who is coming in. How was that person acquired by the enslaver? Oftentimes you'll find their ages in there. You might find relationships. I find those in certificates of importation. Someone is the child, or they're bringing the child of here. There's the ages. They were born in this place. Their mother is here. I mean, it's a great, certificates of importation are great genealogical resources. And they had to be recorded in the courthouse records.
Alicia, did you?
Yeah. I don't know, Dr. Sheri. So many things are going through my brain. I don't know which question to ask you. But the one, I guess, that's uppermost is Ona Judd, who left self-emancipated from Martha Washington, since she was part of her estate, not really her enslaved. I don't know what you call her, but part of the estate. Why is it that you think they knew where she was? Why do you think that they still didn't capture her? I mean, everything I've read, there are always these close calls. Oh, the nephew was in New Hampshire, and Ona Judd was in the house down the street, and everybody knew it. So I'm just perplexed. Just your opinion, because that's all we can know. Why do you think they just left her there?
Well,
or did they?
I'm going to put a shout out to Erica Armstrong Dunbar, who wrote the book about Ona Judd and brings her story to life.
Right.
And something that she goes into the fact of that, yeah, enslavers didn't just stay here in Virginia, right? We see this happening throughout the period of enslavery. They are going, they're taking their trips to the spas, they're finding out what's happening there, they're going to New York, they're sending their kids to school in Philadelphia, they're going to Pennsylvania for business marketing. And every time they're going, they're kind of on the lookout. Is there someone here? And oftentimes they will see someone that, oh my gosh, it looks like the person who left my family, 30 years ago. So there's a lot of these cases, especially after the 1850 with the Fugitive Slave Act, where they now have more legal recourse to capture people in the north. Enslavers were sending spies everywhere to be on the lookout for their lost enslaved people. They didn't give up that hope just because they didn't find it or because no one answered their ad in the newspaper. And it's really incredible because, I mean, this is a society that doesn't have, social media, right? But they do. They have these various communication networks. They are talking to people. They have correspondence that they're with, talking with all kinds of people. They're sending people up north to look for their enslaved people. Now, in the Revolutionary War era, it wasn't the assumption that someone was going to go north. They could have fled by going south, right? I think what made this a delicate situation is because her enslaver were the Washingtons, right? And think about the press that would have made if George Washington is storming into, New Jersey, I think, where she's hiding, and storms in there with the troop and forcibly puts her under lock and key and drags her out. People are going to be talking about that, right? And especially as the man who kind of trumpeted the fact that he was going to free all of his people in his will.
Right.
So he really had to kind of tread carefully with this. And I think he tried the diplomacy route with her, and he had different intermediaries that would go and talk to her as well. But there were also intermediaries that warned her that someone was coming to look for her. And they warned her to, you know what, I don't think they're going to be as nice about it this time. You better leave. So I think there was the nicety at first, thinking that you could woo someone back, right? I mean, even when we're talking about here with the Virginia conventions, wondering how they can counteract the promise of freedom by the British, to join British lines. Okay, can they threaten enslaved people saying, well, you're going to be executed if we catch you? Or, no, we're going to send you to the lead mine, so that'll be the punishment. Well, the other one that I didn't mention, and maybe I should have more strongly, is that if you come back, we'll forgive you, right? If you come back, you'll be forgiven. It'll be okay. If you come back, life will go on as it was. Underneath that message is, guess what who that person left when they left. Ona left family back in Mount Vernon.
Yes.
And any person that runs away is leaving family somewhere. And that enslaver still has their thumb on top of their family. So knowing that their family could be brutalized, that could be tortured, that could be made to confess if they know anything about that, was oftentimes one of the most powerful reasons not to leave. So there's a lot of things going on there, and Oni had to grapple with all of that when she's making this decision.
Right.
Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I just have a comment. Does anybody else have a question? Okay, so you had mentioned the Book of Negroes, and I read in the Cardinal, I think that's a newspaper online, that in Nova Scotia, where they have the Black Loyalty Heritage Center, that they have identified 900 loyalists who came from Virginia.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's an article on that. I have it if anyone wants to see it.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see that.
They have a grant from the Virginia Humanities or something to do a reverse genealogy on those loyalists, descendants of loyalists in Nova Scotia, maybe other places, but definitely Nova Scotia, to look at where they're from in Virginia. And so they're doing a project on that. So
That's so exciting, because the image I put up there of Harry Washington, they're not always saying who the enslaver was, right?
Right.
For him, they pointed out that he was from General Washington. I think they
Yes.
kind of wanted to crow about that a little bit. But yeah, some of the details there, again, I'm sure if you were an enslaved person, you might be a little cautious about who's going to read this documentation. If, just as any runaway would be, any freedom seeker would, once they're captured, they have to make a decision. Do they tell what they know, or do they make a story that might make their next step better? Right? So that's always the challenge of when you're looking at this information. They're not going to tell us the street address of where they were. Today we would think we want to know that information. And it just depends on what they're willing to say when they're, being interviewed, what the recorder needs to write down for his purposes, and then what survives.
right.
Yeah.
Be interesting.
So that's very exciting, though.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that.
So I have a question. When you were doing this research for the specific topic, what surprised you the most? And was there something that really grabbed your attention that you're still researching, or it's on, that long list that we have of our research projects for the future? Is there-
Oh my gosh. Well, I think you got an insight into each question I was asking was something that really made me step back and say, I want to dig a little bit deeper there. I'm really intrigued by how we can use these pension applications to kind of build a composite of what is happening in local places. So, that whole big list, I didn't want to, I know that slide had a lot of stuff in there, but I thought you might not find that in any other place. So looking at these petitions and finding out how did they see themselves and their role in the Revolutionary War, and how did they want to be remembered? I think that's a crucial thing for us to think about, that this aspect of memory is not just for us to decide, right, how we want to remember the event. We also need to be very much listening to the voices of the past and how did they want to be remembered, and what things were important for them to be remembered, to be carried on. And, we are the next generation of interlocutors who are going to carry that story forward. So if we only have this small part of the story, we're missing the others. So, yeah, I'd love to learn more about women, especially what the choices for women and how their lives changed because of the war. Enslaved women and free women of color.
Okay.
Okay, this is sort of like a broad question, takes us out of Virginia, but it deals with the 13 colonies of the United States after 1776. How much of a sticking point was was it with the United States and Britain during the peace negotiations of 1782 and 1783 to pull back those slaves that have ran behind British lines and get compensation, or to actually hand them back over to the owners?
Yeah, you know, that is one of those that I would want to dig in a little further. From what I saw was that, I mean, this really was a sticky point because a lot of people like Washington and Jefferson they had the means and the ability to go straight to the British officials and say, I want my people back, right? Not everyone had that ability. And the British knew that this was going to be a trouble spot. They knew that this could maybe upset the treaty, and yet they went forward anyway. And I think the American colonists realized, you know, we are kind of done with, you know. So I really want to know more about that to see if, again, this was one of those tumbling points, because we do have this narrative that, you know, everything worked out really well, and these, you know, enslaved people went out, and, you know, America won its freedom. We are now the United States. But I think there's a lot more spaces in there that make it a lot more complex and a lot more interesting. So, and definitely those tensions about what was going to win. Was it, you know, the idea that they had made a promise, the British had made a promise, or the idea that colonists had a right to their property? I think those are the two big ideological things that are butting up here against each other. And enslaved people are really, they're driving that conversation. You know, they are the ones that are driving it, saying, I left because I left, and I don't have to be enslaved by that person. And British are saying, you left because we offered this to you. We have kind of a moral obligation now. And Great Britain is also on its way towards abolition as well. So it's a very complex mix of things. Yeah, it's a great question.
A shout out to the YouTube audience. Okay. As a help on that one, Lord Andrew Roberts' book, The Last King of America, about George III, does have a serious talk about the Treaty of Paris and all that. And the two, and this is something to watch as we see various people doing this minuet about what Putin wants to do in Ukraine. The game that was played was that the Americans promised to repay the loyalists for the property that was seized with, of course we're not going to do, you know, of course we're going to do that kind of a thing. And the other thing was that the Americans insisting upon the return of their property and slaves. And the British, of course, saying, oh, of course we'll do that. And so one of the things in diplomacy is that wiggle room and the things that are written on paper that everybody is going, yeah, right. And so, but you're right, it was a very, very contentious part of those discussions and went on for months. Nancy, you want this?
Yeah. Just to follow that up, I mean, this was an issue all the way up to the Jay Treaty and so forth. And people like Alexander Hamilton said, you know, no way, we're not giving these people back. I mean, we're not going to demand that people go back into slavery. So there was, it was like a wink and a nod, right? And probably on both sides for that. Of course, I don't know how many were returned, if any.
Sorry. No, that's okay. And I was going to say, I guess the new Americans decided it was probably contradictory when you allow the white loyalists to take their slaves. So when the white loyalists went to Canada, they could take their slaves. So that was probably a real contradiction, that you couldn't give the slaves back, but you can take the slaves with you to Canada. So I'm sure the Americans were not happy about that either. So I just thought about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really, you know, important part to kind of think about this piece is, you know.
Well, thank you very, very much. That was great. Once again, just a fantastic presentation based on deep research, facts, primary sources. Just loved it. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for coming out. It'll take a couple days, but this will be posted on our YouTube channel, as Bill pointed out. So, yes, Alicia.
Can I just say one thing? Because Dr. Sheri, I call you Dr. Sheri. We have out on our table a painting of Daniel Coleman. It's an interpretation by a local artist. A lot of you know her, Gertrude Evans. So while Dr. Sheri had the documents up there, and we knew there was no photography, there's no way, there's his pension application, but he wasn't a runaway, so there's no even description. So out on the table, if you're a visual person, you say, well, what do you think he even looked like? Well, this is the Black history interpretation of Daniel Coleman as we adopt him.
I love it. And thank you, Ms. Evans, for doing that. I think it adds so much to our understanding of the past when we have kind of a visual reference points and understanding that, it's not going to be the exact same thing, but. And this is something I talk to my students when we bring in images and things. I say, it makes a difference. And they say, too, it makes such a difference when you can look into the eye of someone and find out what was their story or begin to ask questions about their story. So, thank you, everyone. I want to encourage you to keep looking into the eyes and finding those stories. Yeah, thank you.